So we're official now. All right, welcome everyone. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Lauren Klein. Lauren is an associate professor in the departments of English and quantitative theory and methods at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. She works at the intersection of digital humanities, data science, and American culture, with a particular emphasis on issues of gender and race. She is the co-author of Data Feminism. Can you all see that? And it's a book that we recently added to our DePietro library collection. And I hope you can check out her book later on after you hear Lauren speak today. So Lauren's going to speak about digital humanities and how it can contribute to digital literacy efforts. And she will go until about 4:45 or so. And then at that time, she's going to open it up for questions. So Lauren, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Paul, and thanks to everyone for being here. I said this earlier, but I really think that it's true. You know, anyone who shows up at 4 p.m. in the second year of a pandemic to hear a talk about digital humanities, like you already won the day. So thanks for being here. So what I wanted to do today, actually, let me share my screen. Actually, I won't share my screen yet because I'll just tell you a little bit about what I want to do today. I want to talk a little bit about my own trajectory because I think that it's informative just for framing some of the things that the projects that I'll later show, and talking a little bit about how I see the relationship between digital humanities research projects and then also teaching. And so I'm going to spend the first little bit of my talk talking a little bit about the various institutions that I've taught at and learned in. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just sort of defining digital humanities and talking about a couple of the definitions that are in circulation and have been in circulation over the past couple of years. And then I'm going to offer my own definition, which is informed a little bit by some of the work that I do, and then show you some examples. And I will say what I try to do with each of the examples, and hopefully you'll see this, is sort of show you the project, but then also show you sort of a way in which it could be incorporated into pedagogy, into the classroom, into digital literacy in various ways. And hopefully that will sort of give you a sense of what digital humanities entails, what kind of projects it enables. You know, my version is by no means the only version of this, but it's one of them. And if it seems interesting to you, I'd be happy to continue the conversation a little bit later. Okay, so now I will share my screen. Okay, and so here the title of this talk is not that boring. I mean, it's not that interesting. But what I think that I wanted to start just by saying, I think the reason why that I'm here talking about digital humanities is that I edit this book series called Debate in the Digital Humanities. It's been going on for almost a decade, and it is published both in print, physical books, and then also online in an open access website. And it explores debates in the field as they emerge. We publish both, they used to be biannual volumes, but the gaps between them are becoming larger and larger, but those try to really survey the issues and ideas that are in circulation at that time and bring them together. And then we also sort of seek out and also welcome special volumes on topics that have become increasingly pressing in the past couple of years. So you can see here, two of the more recent general anthologies in 2016 and 2019, and then some of our more recent special volumes, one on the digital Black Atlantic, which just came out. Actually just got my packages of books in the mail, but I don't have it within arm's length. Which brings together Black and Africana studies with digital humanities and digital media more generally. We have one called Bodies of Information on Intersectional Feminism and the Digital Humanities, and then another book on critical making, so sort of applied physical fabrication, artworks, things like this in relationship to the humanities. And next in the pipeline, I think we've one on global digital humanities, which is all non-US based examples of this type of work, and then another one on pedagogy. And just very quickly, if you are interested in any of this stuff I mentioned before, you can find it all online. You don't need to buy the books. It's at dhddebates.gc.cuny.edu. And I put this URL up there in part to just let you know that it's out there, but also to sort of pay homage to my CUNY roots, because I mentioned before, I did want to talk a little bit about sort of how I got here. And at this point, this was a very long time ago, but I do think it's important in this context. I did not begin my academic career intending to do digital humanities. I'd been a software developer before I went to grad school, but I decided to go to grad school in English because I really just loved books a lot, and I'd sort of lived through the dot-com crash of the early 2000s and thought that you could really rely on great works of literature in ways that you could not rely on computers. And so I entered into a fairly traditional English PhD program, but I quickly became aware of what they called an instructional technology fellowship, which essentially was a digital pedagogy and digital literacy program. The model was that as grad students who had some sort of technical training, usually not from grad school, we were paired with faculty to work in smallish seminars and just tried to think creatively about how we can incorporate all sorts of digital media and digital technologies into classrooms, but sort of in a pedagogically appropriate way. So this meant a lot of blogs and podcasts and video projects and things like this. And so this actually sort of really got me thinking from the very beginning about the importance of aligning digital technologies with the pedagogical aims or the research aims of, whatever it is that you're trying to do. And I think, some other people approach digital literacy, digital pedagogy, things like this by being really excited by the flashy new thing. And then they try to sort of find a way to hook it back into a course or a project that has already been fully conceived. And I really think about it in a different way, which is you really need to think about these two things together and figure out which digital method or whatever makes sense for the particular aim. And usually it's a conceptual or theoretical or disciplinary aim of the course. So my first job out of grad school was actually working at Georgia Tech. So I was hired to teach humanities courses to engineering students. And so this actually meant digital humanities courses, but they didn't call them that. So I did things like work on digital archives with Georgia Tech's existing sort of minimal archival holdings. I taught one of my research areas is about food. So I taught a course about food and media. So we were thinking about like food blogs and Instagram and things like this. And then in 2016, I got brought in on a grant from the Mellon Foundation to start a digital humanities center. So a physical space that would sort of house the actual technology in order to support this kind of teaching and learning across the College of the Liberal Arts. And the goal was really to create a space for capacity building. So on the one hand, we did purchase like a 3D printer and, all the accoutrements of a digital humanities center, but the co-director and I of the center really thought primarily about how we could build long-term capacity for this type of work. So we held a lot of workshops, we did reading groups, we did sort of provide some seed funding for projects, and things like this. But the goal really was, and actually this was what the sort of the Mellon Foundation had actually come to us and said, we want to fund you because you train engineers, and we want engineers to be thinking humanistically about the technologies that they create. And so it really, from the outset, and actually in ways that were sort of overdetermined by the money that we received, was at its core a pedagogy and a sort of digital inquiry type of space. And then only recently, actually in 2019, I moved to Emory, which I don't know if you know Atlanta, but Georgia Tech and Emory are like 5 miles away from each other. So I didn't move, I just switched my commute in the morning. And so now I have a joint appointment between the English department and they're trying to do an interdisciplinary data science department. And I think this sort of reflects the way in which my research really has sort of tracked my teaching, although sort of following by a couple of years. But also increasingly, my own research has become increasingly focused on data. And so more narrowly, I personally am interested in both thinking critically and humanistically about data systems, and about their impacts. And then on the flip side, sort of thinking in creative ways about how humanities scholars can use data and data science techniques sort of quantitative methodologies more broadly to pursue traditionally humanistic research questions. And I say this, I sort of bring this up for two reasons. One, to say, I started at my new job. I was only there for 5 months before COVID hit. So in a way, I still sort of feel very rooted at Georgia Tech, where I was for almost 10 years. But also I say this as a way of explaining why a lot of the digital humanities projects that I'm about to sort of show you are very data oriented. And this is not true sort of across the field. And I'd be happy to expand upon some other trends that I don't cover as much in this presentation. But that really does reflect sort of like what I think is really interesting in digital humanities right now. And in fact, I nearly retitled this talk Digital Humanities and Data Literacy, because I think that's kind of what I'm going to end up focusing on today. But I thought I should be explicit about that so you don't think that I'm sort of for ideological reasons or sort of interested in right now, sort of constraining your view of the field. But before I get to the examples, I actually did want to spend a little bit of time just doing some level setting about sort of what it is what we talk about when we talk about digital humanities. And for a lot of years, this actually, definitions themselves were a core area of discussion in the field. And there's a couple ways that have sort of been promoted and accepted about defining the field. And one of them is really just taxonomic, is say, okay, what are the kinds of things that you do when you say you're in this field of digital humanities? And they include digital tools and methods which are applied to humanistic research questions. This is what I've already begun to talk about. And then the inverse of that, right? So our humanities approaches to digital tools. And I would say also sort of to digital media more broadly. So you get into things like, social analysis of social media and critiques of digital culture and things like this. It also includes digital pedagogy, so a lot of ed tech and student-centered learning and things like this. And then digital scholarly publishing, which I actually think is sort of a subtext of a lot of the projects that I'll be showing today. But there are people who sort of, as their area of digital humanities research, think about usually online platforms for scholarly publication, for facilitating collaboration, for things like this. But the problem with any of these sort of lists of things, right, is that you can always point out things that are not included in the list and then keep on adding to the list, and it keeps on growing. And so another way that has been presented, which I actually think has holds a lot of weight for defining digital humanities, is what I sort of call the values argument. And so this is like, digital humanities is not defined by what you do, it's defined by how you do it. And this includes, this is what, if you're familiar with Lorraine Daston's idea of the epistemic virtue, sort of these qualities that sort of hold and resonate more than just the terms themselves, and actually sort of structure ways of thinking. And some of these in the digital humanities are openness, inclusivity, access, collaboration, community, experimentation. I also might add play, flexibility, things like this. And if you're interested in reading more about this, there's actually a great essay by Lisa Spiro called "This is Why We Fight" in this Debates in the Digital Humanities series that I just edited. I realized the screenshot, it's actually very tiny, so that's not really a helpful image, but the essay is very good. So if you're interested in that, you could check that out. Here's the definition that another one that I really like. It's sort of the Soylent Green definition, if you know that movie. It's people. Soylent Green obviously is this dystopian future where it turns out that people are eating people. And they don't know it's mystery meat, but it turns out to be people. Anyway, so digital humanities is who's doing it at this particular moment. And, I find this definition is really helpful because there, as with a lot of academic fields, especially people who are geographically isolated from each other, there can be a lot of imposter syndrome. Like, how do I know that I'm really doing digital humanities, or am I just making a blog? It's like, who cares? You are doing digital humanities because you consider yourself someone who is doing digital humanities. And if you get yourself in a room or at a conference with other people who also believe themselves to be doing digital humanities, then you are. And so there actually is and remains a large group of digital humanities Twitter. There's all sorts of lists you can follow. There's a digital humanities Slack, which I actually don't follow as much as I should, but my sense is that it's actually quite active. There's a bunch of conferences. There is a big digital humanities conference that's international. There's a North American one called ACH. The MLA has good digital humanities panels. Increasingly, there are actually workshops at technical conferences devoted to digital humanities. Usually it's alongside computational social science. We're seeing that too. But anyway, you can seek these out. I can talk more about these. I can also just share my slides with you afterwards. There are a number of sort of professional development events, like week-long and weekend-long, ongoing, recurring every year type trainings. The Digital Humanities Summer Institute is one of them. There's also one on the East Coast that Penn for a long time has organized. And then the NEH has its own Office of Digital Humanities that funds not only projects, but also summer institutes and advanced institutes that are held around the country over the year. And those are proposed by individuals, but are places you can go under the auspices of digital humanities to do this type of work. One final definition before I get to the slides that have more than text on them, is this idea that digital humanities is actually just a tactical term, right? It's a useful term in order to get institutions to pay attention to the humanities, to fund the humanities, to sort of get things done, get a new faculty line, get a new staff position, creating sort of authorizing a department to sort of revamp a major or a curriculum or something like this. And this sort of cuts both ways. On the one hand, the digital humanities, I think within the humanities has been vilified a little bit for some good reason, for sort of recognizing the power of this way of deploying digital humanities. On the other hand, if the goal is digital literacy or change in the curriculum or whatever it may be, it's sometimes be helpful to know that these kinds of terms carry resonance and to wield them intentionally, but with the knowledge that they can sort of be used to affect change. But I could also, as with these definitions, I sort of could go on, and there's actually a website, I should have put it up here, where it's just a digital humanities definition generator, where you just reload, and it gives you a new definition of the digital humanities each time, some of which are valid, some of which are absurd. But one of the things that I think both the field has realized, and certainly, and I should have totally credited my co-editor of this series, Matt Gold, who's at CUNY. One of the things that Matt and I increasingly began to ask ourselves is that it's sort of this question of defining digital humanities has diminishing returns, right? It ceases becoming an interesting question once the field exists, is operational, has people working in this space. And the more interesting question is sort of, why does digital humanities matter? And what can this field do? And Matt and I began thinking about this question in the previous administration. So the Debates in the Digital Humanities 2016 came out a few weeks after the 2016 presidential election. And just because of the way that the timeline works on these books, we actually had to start thinking about the next volume in the series that would go on to become the 2019 version, only a couple months later. And we wrote about these questions and these ideas in the introduction to the 2019 book, where we connect digital humanities to what was then, so this was sort of like in the midterms, like the 2018 midterm elections, this kind of time, what seemed to be sort of this increasing environment of fake news, of misinformation, of the breaches of privacy, like what was exposed about Cambridge Analytica, things like this. And what we really focused on in the book was how our work within the digital humanities is enabled by much larger social, political, and technological systems. And we try to make the case in the introduction and then through the essays that we include for work that actively exposes the impact of our embeddedness in these larger complex systems on the one hand, and then on the other hand, brings our technical expertise to bear on these social, which are human problems brought about by these systems. And I think, again, a lot of people can probably get behind that goal, but we try to be a little bit more specific about what that path might take. And so in the introduction to that volume, and again, you can read the intro if you feel like it, this one actually is not that long. We try to sort of describe some of the types of interventions that we think digital humanities type work can do. And in a minute, I'll get to actual projects that sort of show you what I'm talking about, but this is sort of the setup. So work that enables communication across disciplines, across communities and networks, creating platforms, actually doing the work of creating platforms, whether it be like a, an actual WordPress or a story maps, or even just a blog or a forum for a community that amplifies the voices of those most in need of being heard, pursuing projects that perform the work of recovery and resistance, especially in historical contexts, undertaking research in the areas of data ethics and data justice. And this is something where my own work has really sort of doubled down on that particular trajectory. And the goal of all of this is to create these kind of hybrid scholars. And I have a quote up here from Tara McPherson, who's a media studies scholar at USC. And she has a great essay where she talks about what it would take to make, quote, artist theorists, programming humanists, activist scholars, theoretical archivists, and critical race coders. And so this is really the goal, to sort of model this syncretic form of scholarship so that we are able to model for students how they can bring otherwise disparate forms of inquiry together. And so for the sort of second half of my talk, I just want to explain, as I said before, some projects that I think really exemplify some of these different trajectories. And admittedly, they kind of blur into each other, but that's kind of the point, right? Like all of these are kind of allied processes. But in each case, as I mentioned at the outset, I'm going to try to connect the project to its underlying pedagogy, whether it be like a sample assignment or a resource for teachers or notes on process or things like that. Okay. So I'm actually beginning not with a digital humanities project per se, but an artwork. It's created by a digital humanities scholar who is also an artist. She teaches at NYU's ITP program. Her name is Mimi Onuoha. But I like this because it's both theoretically very sophisticated, but in terms of execution is actually quite easy. So it's this artwork called the Library of Missing Data Sets. And this phrase missing data sets that you can see on the slide is Onuoha's way of describing data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need, but because of various reasons, they don't actually exist in real life. So she creates this list that you see on the right. So her list includes data sets like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, people excluded from public housing because of criminal records. This project was from 2016, but like an obvious set of missing data sets that we are all dealing with right now is like, what is the gender and race breakdown of people receiving COVID vaccines in the United States? Or what is a gender and race breakdown of the number of people with COVID in the United States and their outcomes? There's no national comprehensive data set on this. And the reason why, Onuoha would say it's intentionally missing. It's intentionally missing for political reasons, because of the priorities of the institutions who have the ability to control what data gets collected and what data does not. And her whole project is trying to sort of get us to think about how the act of data collection sort of carries with it a set of values of what we think is important enough to study, what problems we think are important enough to solve, and then which ones I mean collectively, like as a country or something like that, which ones we don't care enough about in order to pursue in depth. And so I just want to say briefly what you're looking at. So I mentioned on the right, there's this list of missing data sets that Onuoha compiles. It's actually, she keeps it in a GitHub repository. You can Google it and you'll just find it's just like a text website. And you can read it. And she actually has a really nice artist statement that talks about some of the theoretical underpinnings to this process. But she also has created this artwork, this installation, which is this file cabinet. And it's filled with file folders, and each one of the tabs has one of the titles of the missing data sets on it. And the idea is you sort of tab through the folders and you find one, you think like, oh, that sounds like a really serious issue. Let me learn more about that. And you open the folder and it's empty. And it's both a clever project and a simple project, but it's really profound. And I will say, in my own classes, I've actually incorporated this. I taught a class time is blending together. It was last spring. It was a sort of senior seminar about feminist data science. It was like I was in the data science department, but I was trying to sort of say like, okay, you're interested in social justice, you're interested in tackling questions of inequality. what does this work look like? And we did do more sort of statistical analyses later. But one of the earliest assignments I just had them do was I had them look at this artwork and I said, okay, your job is to write a little blog post on Canvas. You can see it here. I've gotten rid of the student, but identify a missing data set. One that you've thought of, describe why it's missing, as well as what questions it could answer if it did exist. And I found that this assignment was really, really generative, because just this way of thinking about sort of how larger structural forces sort of over-determine and control the work that we do, this was something that our students, especially my data science students, had not really sort of stopped to think about. So now I'm actually going to talk about one of my favorites. Like, it is a digital humanities project. They call it a digital humanities project. It's one of my favorite DH projects ever. And it actually starts kind of as a missing data project, but it becomes so much more. So this is this color conventions project. And these were events that took place in the 19th century in the United States, including in New Hampshire, actually, where Black Americans, both fugitive and free, gathered in person to organize about how to achieve all forms of justice. So not only legal, but also economic justice, educational justice, social justice broadly conceived. And this project sort of serves as a counter to the standard story of abolition in the United States, which tends to credit white abolitionists for leading the cause. And that's primarily because their efforts were recorded in these abolitionist newspapers, which have been preserved because they seemed important at the time. They are physical documents, they went into archives, and then in turn, they become easier for scholars, historians, cultural studies scholars like me, to access them in the present. And then when you're sort of going back to tell the story, you use what you can find, and you center these narratives. But these meeting minutes, the minutes of these in-person organizing meetings, are not preserved to the same degree. However, interestingly, one of the places where these meeting minutes were recorded were in these newspapers. They would be these like news items intermittently, once a month when they were held in a particular local newspaper. And so part of what the project has tried to do is have students involved in reading many of these digitized newspapers, or on the basis of events that they knew to have taken place in a particular time, having students go into these newspapers and identify and pull out the meeting minutes, and then transcribe the minutes so that they can become machine readable text. And in that way, they can sort of, as their own data set, sort of stand alongside this traditional canonical data set in order to sort of reinsert and reascribe credit to these Black organizers who really were doing so much of the work, but whose stories sort of tend to be overlooked in the dominant historical accounts at the time. And the project, it's really incredibly rich. This is it's an Omeka backend. I don't know if you've learned about that yet in your survey of digital platforms and tools. It's for associating essentially images with standard metadata fields, and then you can sort of attach textual descriptions to them. So they have any sort of photo evidence that they've been able to find. They have informational pages about each of the events that they've been able to find. They also have this data set that you can download. It's a really, really great project. But then there's another issue that the Color Conventions Corpus really, really thinks hard about, which is that even though they're solving one missing data problem, they're also not solving another, which is that these convention minutes, they derive from the official meeting minutes of the conventions, and only men could be official participants in the meeting. But they know from images like this that often the wives came too, or the wives would travel with their husbands to the meeting, but then the women would stand outside and watch the kids while the men went inside and stuff like this. And so the project is so intent on sort of writing the balance of the historical record. They have all sorts of teaching materials. It's just, I could go on, I could do a whole talk about this project. I just think it's very fantastic. But they have teaching partners. When you download all their teaching materials, they ask that you sign as the teacher a memo of understanding that says, at the same time that you talk about one of these men organizers at these meetings, we also want you to introduce a woman who is also involved in the conventions, like a wife or a daughter or a sister or a church member, and ideally perform research recovery work on this new person, and then write back to them at the project so they can add this new person into their website and their database. And so I could go on about this, but I think what they're doing, it's so intentional, it's so well thought through, and it's a model of so many different kinds of digital humanities pedagogy in ways that hopefully you can already sort of see how it connects to the previous sort of concepts that I was outlining up before. I am going to turn though to an example that's more contemporary, and I'm going to do it in order to illustrate a totally different idea, but it actually is also a sort of a missing data project. So this is one of a collection of many, many maps created by what's called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. They go by the AEMP. They bill themselves as a collective, but actually secretly, it's mostly humanities graduate students who have started and run this project. But what they've been doing is since 2013, they've worked in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in the Bay Area to collect and map data about the eviction crisis there, right? This is happening because of Silicon Valley and the way in which, oh, I just realized my slides are kind of not in order or slightly off center. I wonder if I can fix that. Nope, did not fix that. Going back to that. Okay, sorry about that. So in the Bay Area, obviously because of Silicon Valley, tech workers move in, they make ridiculous salaries, they can pay much higher rent, they push out pretty much everyone else. They're doing everything they can to get everyone else out of San Francisco, creating a real problem. But what the AEMP hasn't tried to do is set out to map, sort of to count and sort of count and map the scope of this problem. And they've also conducted video interviews with many of the people who are being in the process of being evicted to try to get the full extent, not just of recording people as data, but also trying to say this impacts lives, right? Like behind each one of these little red dots is a person or a family. And so that's actually what you see in the screenshot on the right is just a still of their video interviews. And I like to bring this up because you might look at this map and think like, it's just a Google map. It doesn't look official. It's not performing real work or something like that. And this is a comparison that I talk about in data feminism. We compare this with the work of the Eviction Lab at Princeton. And the Eviction Lab's goal is similar, is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis, which is like in itself is a really valuable project, but it's really, really different in terms of process. So you might look at this and you might think, I'm looking at more, right? Like I'm looking at more data. This is the whole country. This looks more rigorous, right? They're using some sort of more sophisticated technical system for mapping. And you might sort of think this is a better project, but what the AEMP has shown is that because this eviction lab needs to use national real estate databases, they're dramatically undercounting evictions because they're only counting the ones that are sort of formal legal evictions where you go to City Hall and file the paperwork and then get served with an eviction notice, rather than all of the different other ways that you can sort of be de facto evicted from your home because your landlord doesn't fix the leak in your ceiling or harasses you or raises the rental or whatever. But the point being, the AEMP, that previous map, because they worked with local communities, actually gathered more accurate and more contextualized data that documented a greater extent of the problem at hand. And again, translating this process to the classroom might seem hard, but the AEMP is really invested in this, and they produced guides that document their own process. They have really good documentation about, you can see on the right over here, their field guide for conducting oral histories, for example, the process that they use to create those video interviews. And then also there's another sort of local sort of field guide that I've used in my own work that comes from Georgia Tech and a center that was devoted to community relationships and sort of service learning. That's this Atlanta community engagement playbook. And it just has some really good practical advice for so you want to work with a community group in order to do this kind of work. How should it be structured? What questions should you be asking? How should this relationship be set up so that it doesn't become, on the one hand, like a big drain on your time, and on the other hand, a big drain on the community group's time and knowledge and resources. So I wanted to put that out there. I want to talk about a different project, actually. This is a little bit more of a sort of outside of the classroom project, but one that is absolutely coming from the field of DH. And I think I sort of labeled it under this idea of connecting disciplines and communities, but it is also a data justice project. It is also a form of resistance using technology type of project. Really, a lot of these projects, I think, are very convergent in their aims. So this one came about actually very quickly. It's called Torn Apart Separados. And it came about in the wake of the crisis at the border when it was revealed that immigrant children were being separated from their parents. And a group of humanities scholars who, from Latinx studies and just in general, who were concerned about, humans, thought like, we in the digital humanities, we should be able to help solve some of this problem. Like, who are these children? How can we find them? People, like, how can we bring these different fields together? These are kind of the skills that we have, the sort of linking of the data sets with the interface, the connecting the sort of significance, the human significance of data to the people who know how to analyze it. And they mobilized really quickly. And a lot of this work took place actually it was during a conference, I believe it was during the Digital Humanities Conference in 2018, maybe 2017. I'm not entirely sure of the timeline, actually. But the reason why I wanted to highlight it, not because, and it turned out to be a really interesting project that did in fact make some connections that between other people's research that hadn't been made before. But the reason why I bring it up here in terms of this question of connecting disciplines was that the project came about out of a goal to say, like, how can we bring things together here? And I actually wanted to turn to this page too, because they were very open about the fact that they did not have either all the skills they needed or all the data they needed in order to sort of do the work they wanted to do. And they just reached out, and various organizations, newspapers and journalism outfits, some nonprofit groups, some other academics in other fields sort of like joined on to the task because they recognized that the need for this type of project was so great. And it ended up being really successful, I think in large part because they opened themselves up. They sort of offered themselves up as the people doing the translation work. They're like, this is what we want. These are the skills we need. And if you come to us, we'll figure out a way that all of you can work together. And I think that, in a way, this kind of exploratory data work, the sort of identifying what can be told through a data set, doing some sort of initial exploratory analysis with very basic tools, and then at that point seeking out additional domain experts, whether it's just sort of students who are majoring other fields, whether it's faculty advisors who can come in and help sort of shape a project. Like, this is a way that projects can take shape too. And as sort of a different version of this, I wanted to call attention to Miriam Posner's work. She's at UCLA in the Information School, and she teaches a lot of classes in Intro to Digital Humanities. And one of the assignments that she does that I've always thought has been really great is giving students what she calls a data package. And this is sort of a curated data set that she has selected that is the right size. And if you go to her website, she actually has a lot more information about it. But the salient points are that it's like not too big and not too small. It's big enough to be interesting, not too big to be unmanageable. It comes from some sort of institution. So there's a little bit of a story behind it, like a rationale for why it exists in the world. She also importantly identifies a domain expert, and she has the students interview that domain expert as part of their process. And they're told to ask questions like, what kind of questions do you think this data set could answer? What kind of things do you think are missing from this data set? And then over the course of the semester, when she teaches students basic data analysis tools, basic data visualization tools like Tableau and stuff like that, then they produce these sort of standalone single websites that record the results of their investigations into this particular data set. And you can see a couple of them right here. So these end up being like not exceptionally sophisticated projects in the end, but I find this process and sort of the message that it conveys to students about how you need to approach data really, really compelling, because she's essentially saying like, yes, you can do this, but you also need to talk to people who know more about the context of the data than you do. And it's fine to ask those people questions. And in fact, you should ask those people questions before you undertake this kind of work. And so just an example, so this one, I believe, is just geolocating the locations mentioned in book titles from the New York Public Library's circulation records. I don't know much more about it than that. But it's, it's this website, there's a couple of tabs, and they have a visualization like this that they made in Tableau. This one is about historical restaurant menus. And similarly, you can see it's a basic WordPress site. There's like a little bit of context, a little bit of description, and some basic bar charts about these are the types of, I actually can't even read this. I screenshotted it late. I think it's sort of specific dishes that are mentioned with frequency in this set of menus. But again, like none of the outputs are exceptionally sophisticated, but it's the sort of thinking beyond and this thinking holistically about what a data analysis entails that makes this really compelling. So the final project that I want to discuss is one that is very recent. It was only launched maybe 2 weeks ago, and it encapsulates just so much of what I think digital humanities can do when it sees itself as a field that connects disciplines, that amplifies voices, that performs this work of resistance, that is able to intervene in questions and issues of social justice. This project, it's called Homegoing. It's a recent project by the group COVID Black, which is directed by Kim Gallen at Purdue. She's a historian, and particularly a historian of late 19th, early 20th century Black culture in the United States. She also has written a really amazing essay in one of the earlier DH Debates volumes called Making the Case for Black Digital Humanities, which is just like a total tour de force essay, and I would absolutely recommend reading it. But with this project, what Gallen and her team did was create a digital memorial to the Black Americans who have died of COVID. And so you can see there's a screenshot at the left. I've tried to sort of pull pieces of the website to highlight them. The themes of the project are both data and honor, and those are equally important to her. And what the team did first was simply to gather the names of people who had died. And rather than represent them as data, they painstakingly tracked down photos and obituaries for each of these people who were named in the data set. And then on the website, if you click on one of the small names or one of these small photos, it brings up one of these little capsule biographies, along with a link to more information where they found this information about the people. And students participated in this work. They helped Gallen track down and sort of as systematically as they could identify the names of these people who had died. They also all worked on, I know this because Gallen actually tweeted a lot about this process, worked on a Google Sheets collaboratively in order to link up the people with any additional information they could find. And I sort of bring up the back end to say, aside from the design of the website, this wasn't exceptionally technical work. And yet it is so much connected to questions about data and questions about the uses of data and what data sort of elides and omits. And the cumulative effect of the project is just so strong. I mean, what Kim Gallen is trying to do is refusing to let these people be anonymized as data points. And she's really insisting that we recognize like individual life, right? And in this way, this is really how it's sort of challenging and pushing back against these institutional injustices and oppressions that we are seeing sort of all around us. And even in the name of the site, and Gallen explains this idea of homegoing is this way of celebrating and paying respect to Black people in death in a way that is not often accorded them in life. And, and I think at this time when we know that Black Americans are being killed by COVID at a rate of at least twice that of white Americans, this website, this memorial, which was student created over the course of only a couple months, that really didn't require that much in the way of technical skill, but really required sort of holistic and syncretic thinking about what a project about COVID and data and humanity could do. It endures as just this really powerful sort of witness and testimony to this issue that we're all facing now. So I actually think this ended up relatively on time. So this is actually the final point that I want to make, which is kind of already obvious from these examples, I think. But I think that what I want to say, and I want to say it out loud, that digital humanities is in itself a digital literacy project and a data literacy project in particular through the examples that I've shown. And I think that, while it rarely positions itself as such, these kinds of literacies, these digital literacies, these data literacies, are acquired as much in the process of working on projects like these, and in classroom projects like these, as they are, as much as they are in specific units about like how you, design a data visualization or how you analyze a spreadsheet or whatever it was you may do. And then, the other point that I want to make here by way of conclusion is that digital humanities does not, or at least it sort of tries not, to erect distinctions about sort of levels of rigor or sophistication on the basis of like the size of the data set, the digital tools that are employed, or the technical expertise of the people undertaking the work. The goal of these projects and the strength of these projects rests in their humanistic orientation. Sort of what is the humanistic contribution that they are making, and how are they conceived to intervene into questions that humanities scholars know are important. And the end result is that I think we do produce these sort of hybrid scholar practitioners that I mentioned at the outset. So artists, theorists, programming humanists, activist scholars, theoretical archivists, these critical race coders, and more. And I think, why they do is because the nature of the work virtually assures them. So that's all I've got. If you want more information, here again is the URL of the book, that I mentioned. This is my own research lab. Our website is actually not that great, but if you're interested in some of the projects that we do, you can find that information there. And I have a website, and I'm on Twitter and GitHub and all that stuff. So thank you so much for listening. And I am going to, here we go. And I'm interested to hear your questions and your comments.
Yeah, so folks, go ahead and just feel free to ask Lauren questions. John put in the chat, what is a critical race coder? Maybe that'll kick us off.
Sure. I mean, I think that what McPherson had in mind was someone who is sort of able, sort of along the lines of that last project that I showed, someone who is able to acknowledge these sort of histories of data and how the idea of data and the process of sort of converting people into data is tied up in the legacies of slavery and the erasure of humanity and things like this, and tries to account for some of that erasure and these historical valences as they perform their contemporary work. I mean, that's to the extent that I understand what she was getting for, but I think a lot of these ideas, they're sort of, she was trying to capture pairings that seemed interesting and provocative and might not yet exist, right? But her point was like, I want to see people who are thinking about how these things intersect. And I think the digital humanities can be a field where this happens.
Thank you.
I really liked your point towards the end about how there should be no sort of judgment based on like skill levels and tools used and whatnot. I like hearing that. I'm a artist and designer, and I've taught at design schools where there very much is a lot of gatekeeping in terms of, oh, you're not using this software. And even though I know that software and I teach that software, I'm kind of like, who cares? Just, the goal is to complete the project and hit the goals. So I like that. It's a really good point.
No, honey, those aren't good. Those aren't good for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point is so important to underscore, right? It's like you can have the good projects are good because the thinking is good, right? They're not good because of technical mastery or, that is not enough to produce a good project. And it's so much easier to make a good project that uses simple tools, I think, than it is. And if you sort of start by thinking like, what do I want to do? And what's the best way that I personally can achieve it, rather than feeling like it somehow you need to use like ArcGIS in order to do a mapping project or something. Because the end result, like, you'll just spend so much more time doing that. And the reality, I think, right now is that, and this is increasingly true every day, so many of these tools that used to be inaccessible and really hard, there are now much easier, usually web-based versions of things that do just the same thing. And I think it is rarely the case, with the exception of only a handful of technical fields, that you are judged on the implementation, sort of the methods that you employ, that's sort of digital tools and methods that you employed, more so than the goal of the project, especially when there's so much content and thinking that goes into the project that eventually lives online or as a podcast or whatever. And like I've always thought that. And again, as someone who, like, I myself do use some pretty sophisticated things for some of my projects, but for other projects I don't, you know. And that's, I think that's important to recognize.
So a question here in the chat: can you recommend some additional digital history mapping projects for historical geography?
Sure. This is such a good question. In a way, there's so many. Let's see. Ones that I've liked recently. Well, I feel like in general, there's a whole bunch that are being done with story maps, which I think is something, Paul, you mentioned that you've learned that recently, right? Or been teaching that recently.
There were one of the speakers talked about story mapping a lot, yeah, and story.
I'm trying to find. I just saw a really great project on the Great Dismal Swamp. It's by Christy Hyman, who does historical geography. Let me see. And it's interesting both because, okay, so this is not the project, but this is just the first thing that I Googled. And she has actually done a bunch of really, really good digital mapping projects. I'm trying to think, what else is really good? I know Cameron Blevins, he's done some, this is a more sort of more sophisticated one, but he has a really interesting mapping project about the historical postal service, where he has a book that's come out recently, but he talks about the relationship between the locations of postal routes and the development and colonization of the West. You're getting a kind of funny, off the top of my head type project. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I know that Roy Rosenwig Center at CNH&M, let's find, they do a lot of mapping stuff. Yeah, so they really they have a lot of like digital history and historical geography and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, there's a ton out there. I think that increasingly the problem is like there are too many good projects to name.
I was really struck, Lauren, throughout your presentation on your emphasis on social justice issues and data justice issues. I thought that was really an interesting angle that you took. How did you particularly develop an interest in the data justice angle?
That's a good question. You know, in my historical work, so I'm trained as an early Americanist, and my first book was about food in the early republic, but I dealt a lot with slavery, and I dealt a lot with the records of enslavement, which are essentially databases. And so for a long time, I've been thinking about, you know, I think kind of what I said before already with respect to the critical race coder comment, you know, how data is this concept that sort of tracks the rise of global capitalism, and it has been particularly wielded as a tool of power to divest people of their humanity. And I mean that, you know, like there's a way that you can sort of say that and toss it off as like a glib, you know, social justice warrior type comment, but like I truly, deeply, like I really believe that. And so moving into the present, you know, when we see all of these examples of like, you know, I don't know if any of you followed the criminal risks, the pretrial risk assessment algorithm expose, where it showed that now many jurisdictions in the country use an algorithm to decide how much of a flight risk someone is as they're awaiting a trial. And lo and behold, it discriminates against Black people and Black men in particular. There's all the stuff with facial recognition software, how it not only is unable to recognize people with darker skin because the algorithms have only been trained on data sets of white faces. But then nevertheless, in spite of the really terrible accuracy, it's overwhelmingly used to surveil and police Black and brown people. Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Mass Destruction talks about predictive policing. And like, there's just, every single system seems to be another instance of this algorithmic bias. And to me, they all sort of seemed connected. Like there was a continuity that I wanted to trace into the present. And I thought that, I could play a small role in that. And that just seemed, a thing. It seemed important for me to say that. It seemed, I think, especially in the past couple of years, I've been searching for ways that my own scholarship can sort of have more impact in the world. And so that's sort of, how I headed there. And part of that was intentional. And part of that was just sort of realizing at the moment that there were things that I could say.
We've probably got time for one last question. If anybody has one. It's about 4:57 right now.
Oh yeah, someone put a link into that Du Bois book, which is terrific. And undersold fact, he actually developed, Du Bois made these data visualizations essentially about racial justice, but he did them with his students at Clark Atlanta, or it used to be Clark, or Atlanta University is now Clark Atlanta, which is down the road for where I live.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. I think we're just about done for this afternoon. We'd like to thank you very much, Lauren. That was fascinating. All of our speakers are so interesting because they're coming at things from different angles, and it's just expanding our minds, which is the goal of the whole initiative. So thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Great, thanks so much for listening, everyone. I hope you get to enjoy your weekends a little bit.
Yes, there still is that thing called the weekend, isn't there? I think. All right, and Lauren, I'm sure you'll be able to send us your slides and everything, and obviously this has been recorded if you want to share this with any of your friends later on once it's up on the Ideal Canvas page. So thank you all very much, folks, and thank you again, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren.
Bye.